It's so quiet. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Candace Summers, and I'm the Senior Director of Education here at the museum. And I'd like to welcome you to tonight's panel discussion, which will focus on the impact of asbestos in the workplace in Central Illinois. Because it didn't just have an impact here in Bloomington Normal, it impacted throughout the entire region. Before I turn the program over to our moderator, Charlie Schlenker, senior reporter at WGLT, I would like to thank LEUNA, Midwest Region Laborers International Union of North America, sponsor of our current exhibit, A Deadly Deception, the Asbestos Tragedy in McLean County, which is on the 3rd floor of the museum. So if you haven't seen it, don't worry, still plenty of time. It will be up through 2020.
Again, to see this very powerful exhibit on our 3rd floor. I'd also like to thank our live stream sponsor for this evening, WGLT, your local public media, which is part of the NPR network. I want to remind everyone that this program is being live streamed and recorded, so if you don't want it to live on the internet forever, mind your P's and Q's. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charlie Schlenker.
Thank you, Candace, and welcome everyone again. We should note that yesterday, remember those who've fallen on the job from accidents or from occupational exposure. European researchers discovered a link to cancer and asbestos early in the 20th century. In the 1930s, the industry in the US did its own studies confirming this link and squelched them as proprietary. They hid them. A United Asbestos and Rubber Company opened in 1951, called UNARCO. They would ease workers out who started to show symptoms, and they were closely monitoring the health of their workers to make sure that they could pinpoint that time. That came back to bite them later, much too late for many people. Let me introduce our panelists. Larry Mertes, who has worked at UNARCO during college in 1969 to 1972-ish, while he lived at Wright Hall at ISU. Cheryl Wills, who now lives in eastern McLean County, but grew up in part in Bloomington Normal. Her dad, Willard, died from mesothelioma after working at UNARCO for a brief period of time, and then being exposed to asbestos in his later working life. Her brother has also now passed away from a rare cancer, just recently, a rare cancer linked to asbestos exposure. George Martinez is an instructor at the Illinois Laborers and Contractors Apprentice Training Program, Training Center, teaching union workers how to deal with asbestos, safely remove it, abate it, and certifying them according to state regulations. He is a 38-year member of Laborers Local 362. And if asbestos is not your thing, he also teaches environmental courses in lead and mold remediation. So, an expert, to be sure. Finally, Jim Walker, a noted attorney in the local legal community and a nationally regarded litigator in asbestos cases. Welcome to you all, and thank you for coming. First, conditions at the plant, and we'll start with Larry and Cheryl. What did you see there and later at home? And Larry, why don't you just tell us your experience at UNARCO?
Well, when I didn't know anything about asbestos when I went there. I went there for financial reasons. I was a student at ISU, and there was a young man living in Wright Hall with me who lived on the 2nd floor. And somehow we connected, and he said, well, I'm working 3 to 11 at this plant on the west side of Bloomington. And I said, well, that sounds pretty interesting. I could probably make some money doing that. So I went over there and I applied, and they hired me. A side note to that story is a little sad. Probably about 3 or 4 months later, the young man got electrocuted at the same plant. I don't know. I tried to research that today on the archive of the pantograph, but I couldn't get into the site. But basically it was economics, and I didn't know anything about asbestos at the time. I just needed some money.
What did you see?
Well, there
and
was
you didn't work in the asbestos unit, you worked in the urethane
there
unit.
was a urethane unit, but it
What did
was
you see
not
as
very
far
far
on
away.
asbestos?
Well, I can remember one man. He was an older man, and he wore like a bib apron type thing. And I saw him all the time because I was going to the lunchroom or whatever, and he was cutting pipe wrap. You know, like he had these like cubes of asbestos, molded asbestos, and he ran this bandsaw that cut pipe wrap. Well, and of course there was dust everywhere. I remember that specifically, and I also remember that at times they took us to an area where they made the board. It was called an autoclave. They threw the asbestos in a hopper and chopped it up, made it fine, and they mixed it with a slurry, whether a gypsum or a cement, to make it a board or to make these cubes so that they could cut it into shape. And there was times when we weren't very busy in the urethane thing, that we'd go over there and we'd clean up, sweep the floor, clean the autoclave, things like that. So there was really not a separation in the factory from if you're working in the urethane section or you're working in the asbestos section. The dust was everywhere.
Did you have to handle asbestos occasionally yourself?
Yes. One of the last things that there was me and I think 3 other young men. Right before I got hired to work out of the labor hall, I remember there was 2 boxcars clear it would have been on the east side of the building because they still had the tracks that ran into the building because it had been a railroad maintenance facility. And we were hired or told to unload these bags of asbestos from South Africa. We stacked them probably stacked them almost as high as the ceiling here, those 2 boxcars. And that was the first time I really got noticing that this can't be good, because it's like crystallized a product that looks like it's like little hairs on a little rock fiber thing. But I'm glad that I didn't work there much longer after that. But that was when I was really exposed to it, probably.
Cheryl, what was your dad's experience working there?
It was in the early 50s. Mom and Dad were married young and started a family the next year, and Dad needed work. And so there was a man, we lived out in Aerosmith. We talked about the impact. It wasn't just here in Bloomington Normal. People came in from all around the county to work there. So there was a man out in our town, and he worked at UNARCO. And so Dad started working there. They actually carpooled back and forth together. And he did not work there for a long time, but he worked directly in the asbestos. He unloaded it. I guess it came in, and then they cut it open to go down, and the asbestos just went everywhere.
Did it come home with him?
And absolutely, he brought it home on him. He would come in, and Mom would shake out his clothes, of course, because she did the laundry. I remember my brother talking about looking back at that time. He would have been about 4 years old at the time, and every little boy wants to walk around in Daddy's boots. And Dad would come home, and Terry would put on Dad's work boots and clomp around in them. Just imagine how full those boots were of that asbestos.
Any puffs of dust coming around the corner, or what?
It was he definitely brought that asbestos home on him. Dad told us about this after he was diagnosed. I said he worked there as a young man. He wasn't diagnosed with mesothelioma until he was about 50 years old. He was a carpenter. After he left there, then he was a union carpenter for the rest of his career, which I'm sure he continued to have some exposure to asbestos that way.
How prevalent was asbestos in the everyday materials that he was handling? It was still considered a wonder material at the time.
Yeah, and it was in, he would do drywalling, the drywall and the taping, and the caulk that he used. I remembered Dad was a guy that could do a lot of things. He could work on a car. He could fix a car. And one of the things that he would do is, change the brakes on the car. Later, we find out that dust that you blow out of there, that was asbestos.
Asbestos brake pads.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. And he worked out there doing that, and with my brother right alongside, learning how to do that. So that was a continued exposure even past his UNARCO, but at UNARCO he had the direct exposure. He did not have a mask to wear. Some of the guys tied the big men's hankies around their face because it was an irritant. And management came out and told them to take them off.
Did they say what?
They were told to take them off.
What sort of safety precautions did you see working there in the 69 or 70?
There wasn't much. There was, at one point, maybe after Owens Corning took it over, they might have provided us with the little thin paper masks like you would use if you're well made. They're not even as good as what we had for COVID, but they were just a thin little paper mask that would get, if you were warm, mine safety masks or anything like that. I think when Owens Corning did come in, they put in an exhaust system, that sucked the air out. But I think from what I saw, there wasn't any filters on it. It just threw the dust out into the neighborhood. So it didn't improve much.
Jim Walker, UNARCO gave way to Libby Owens Corning. How did the way the company handled worker safety change over the arc of the time when litigation was beginning to become a thing?
Well, it was never safe enough. It was never safe enough. Whatever things Owens Corning may have instituted that Union Asbestos wasn't already doing were still known to Owens Corning at the time to be inadequate. Owens Corning did an x-ray study of the workforce when it bought the plant, and those people who had sufficient x-ray changes to indicate to Owens Corning that, that the non-cancer asbestos disease called asbestosis had already started in their chest. They sent them to a doctor to be worked up. And again, going back to the old Union Asbestos habit of trying to ease people out, what Union Asbestos meant by easing them out is try to get them out of the workforce without really telling them that they were in the early stages of disease. Owens Corning did something similar to that in order to get the sickest members of the workforce out of the workforce. But there still, of course, were a number of Owens Corning employees who got sick, not necessarily just from the Owens Corning exposure, but because they had maybe worked there 3, 5, 10, 15 years before Owens Corning bought the plant for Union Asbestos. Owens Corning was a little more sophisticated in that it had a medical director. The medical director put on paper the extent of the disease within these people, and the medical director knew that the levels of airborne asbestos at the plant when Owens Corning started operating it were still completely too high and had caused disease in other locations, and they knew that it was going to continue to cause disease here.
So what would they tell him to get him out the door, if not the truth?
Well, I don't know that there was just one thing. Maybe we just don't need as many people in your area, or you've been, if you're really sick, you've been missing too much work, just different things to try to get them out. They weren't always successful. Some people stayed until they just plain were too sick to work, and then Owens Corning had to deal with the problem a statute called the Occupational Disease Act, which is sort of the sister law to the Workers' Compensation Act, and some people filed Occupational Disease Act claims.
George Martinez, how differently is asbestos handled today in safety procedures? Obviously, it's no longer in use, it's been outlawed in use, but how, since it's everywhere, was everywhere for decades, how is it dealt with today?
Well, what we do now is more training to make it safe for not only the workers, but for the public. And what we end up doing at our training center, we train the workers on how to remove it safely by using mist water, which they call a surfactant that we put on it. And if it is something like it's sprayed on to reduce any type of airborne fibers in the air, to where respirable dust gets in the air, that's what goes into your lungs and gets breathed in.
How busy are local laborers in remedying asbestos all these decades later? How much work is there in this field?
Well, there's a lot of asbestos that are still in a lot of buildings, especially older buildings prior to 1980. There is a lot of work that's still to be done. It just depends on when either the schools or building owners want to remove it.
We should note that some years ago, Chittick's Junior High School in Normal had to close for a time during the school year because asbestos was discovered to have become friable when some kids started banging on certain things and it busted open. And the Normal Public Library just recently closed for upwards of a year while they abated asbestos insulation on structural girders, which had been fireproofing. So how stringent are the precautions to prevent workers from knowingly being exposed? Is there air quality sampling during abatement projects? What goes on?
Yes. They monitor the air, so that way, for two reasons. One is to make sure that there is no release of asbestos outside of the abatement area, and also that you have the proper PPE to protect yourself.
Jim Walker, when did regulations start on asbestos and why? Take us through how there became this dawning awareness that this was really bad. Dawning public awareness, I should say.
The British started some regulations in 1930 and 1931 under their, what they called the factory inspectors statute and system, but they were more suggestive than absolutely a criminal violation to exceed them. Then similar things started in the United States where different groups or sectors of society suggested that you shouldn't exceed certain airborne levels. It was black humor, I guess, but there never has been, even to today that I'm aware of, a safe level of exposure to asbestos below zero. Every time a group of people have been submitted to a known level of asbestos of exposure, some people in that group have come down with asbestos disease. And that was sort of the way airborne levels were set. Well, if the level is X and now we find that people are getting sick at that level, then the level was reduced to something less than X. But again, with no evidence that this new standard would keep people safe from disease. So at every level that was set, people were getting sick. The first real enforceable regulations came under what's called the Walsh-Healy Act, which applied only to situations where products were being made for the federal government. Products were made for the federal government here at the Union Asbestos Plant, so the Walsh-Healy Act was applicable. They had airborne levels there that were way in excess of all standards. It was never shut down. Then in 1970 and 71, the OSHA statute came into effect, and there were levels set as a part of the federal OSHA standard that applied to all factories of a certain size. Those levels were much lower, but still, as time progressed, people exposed at those levels also became sick.
How did you get into this area of the law? Well, how did it start?
As a young lawyer, I was the youngest lawyer in a firm in town where an older lawyer left to be a part of a different firm. And, we have a joke among lawyers that certain things run downhill. And one of the files that, like one of Cheryl's here thickness, that he left was about a man who had a disease called asbestosis. And he put a little note about the lawyer that left dead about 4 by 4 inches on top of that, and told me that he was leaving this file and kind of like, good luck with whatever you can do with it. And that turned out to be my first client, a man named Chuck Hammond. And he and 2 of his friends were my first 3 clients, and each of them were witnesses in the other's Occupational Disease Act trials. And they were well respected within the workforce there. When I was able to recover something for them, and even before that, so the word sort of went out from them to other people that started being diagnosed that go see this guy, and things just kind of grew from there.
How many cases did you handle over the years? And by the end, was it all of your practice, essentially?
When I first started practicing, I did general practice, and I got into litigation where I represented people that got injured in sudden traumatic things like car accident, wrecks, or a work injury of some type. But then I got slowly into asbestos, and so by the time I retired, there was about 85% of my work was representing people that had asbestos disease.
Do you have an estimate of how many people represented over the years in this area?
I don't have hard facts. I think I represented families that either I represented the worker or the family of the worker who had already died before the family hired me, at least involving the lives of more than 100 workers. Not all of them from the Bloomington plant. As we grew in our knowledge about asbestos disease and about the litigation that arose from it, why we started doing other work sites like Caterpillar in Peoria or ADM and Decatur, other industrial places where workers had an asbestos exposure.
Cheryl, let's talk a little more about the impacts on families. What happened to your dad? Share that story, would you?
When Dad was about 50 years old, he was not feeling well. For Dad to not be feeling well, he was not feeling well. He was a strong, big, tall man, hardworking, had no health problems. No high blood pressure. He didn't drink alcohol. He had a healthy diet, and he was not feeling well. And he went. Finally, he went to the doctor and was having a little bit of shoulder discomfort, and one thing led to another, and ultimately they determined that he had mesothelioma, and we were stunned. It was something that we never expected, had never even been presented to us as a possibility. Mom and Dad had been foster parents and had also adopted children. So at that time, Dad was still in the height of his working. He still had the youngest adopted son was still at home, and life changed that day we got that diagnosis. It changed everything. He quickly was not able to work anymore. So of course the family income. He was still raising a family. Changed. He went from a very strong, healthy man to this disease gradually just took him down more and more and more. There was no, we did some treatment. We know it can't be cured, but you're always hoping. He did some treatment for it, which, was not successful. And he did live, I think it was about 5 years. They'd originally said he had about 6 months. But because he was such a strong, healthy man, the only thing that was wrong with him was that he had mesothelioma and that it was going to eventually take his life, which it did.
What emotional toll did that take on the family?
Well, again, he was at that age, and he was at the height of his life, really. The way I look at it now, at my age, and that's, he was working, thinking someday I'll retire, and the things I'll do when I retire, and he had worked so hard for so many years, and to see all that taken away.
How old were you and your brother?
When Dad actually passed away then, he actually, May 1st, so that anniversary date is coming up, 1989, is when he passed away then. So Terry and I would have been in our 30s at that point. So we were beginning our careers, we were having our families. This was, the next phase for everybody. And so my mother lost her husband while she was still trying to raise a child. We lost our father. My daughter, there was one grandchild at that point, and who he absolutely adored. That grandchild lost her grandpa, and the future grandchildren that were born never got to know their grandpa. And he was a man well worth knowing. He was. We lost having our father for the rest of our life, but that next generation lost the access to a man who could have been such a mentor for them.
So there's that emotional loss, that family heritage of wisdom loss.
Absolutely.
Are there other economic losses that percolate from generation to generation rather than just the immediate impact on the family when the earner's wages are lost?
Sure. Dad had worked. He was conservatively saving and putting back. And when a catastrophic illness like that happens, it depletes the family's resources. And then the generational wealth that he had been attempting to build was gone. That was something that he would have left to his children and his grandchildren, and that all was eaten up for my mother to go ahead and survive, to go ahead and raise the child that was still at home.
Thank you. There's always a power imbalance between workers and businesses. It's information, it's money, it's the power to employ and fire, the power to hide, the power to lobby. And this is for all of you, how do you see this manifested in the asbestos industry? Let's start with you, Larry.
Well, I think it was pretty one-sided, probably on the owner's side, because if they had the information that we didn't have, they were basically lying to us and using our physical abilities to get rich or to whatever they were doing, because I didn't know anything about it. I mean, and I'm sure a lot of the people that worked there didn't know anything, and a lot of them had worked there for 20 years, So it was criminal, as far as I'm concerned. If they knew this was going to hurt you, and it must not have been any conscience there, even the employees that were in the management section probably were being duped. I mean, even if they weren't working in the factory, they were still breathing the same air. So it just isn't right. It wasn't right.
George, how do you see that play out? Cheryl, did you have a thought?
Well, when you say it's just wrong, it, there's a piece to that. I'm a registered nurse, and so what I've learned through the information since the exhibit opened is that there were actually doctors on the payroll to keep this information quiet. There were doctors, MDs, that were hiding the information from the clients, the patients, the workers. When they were ill, they were being having x-rays done that were not adequately or appropriately being interpreted. It's wrong. I can't even think of a word to use. It's more than wrong.
Criminal.
Yeah.
Jim, your professional life, in part, is dedicated to rectifying that imbalance of power. How do you see that act?
Well, Union Asbestos had a plant at Cicero, Illinois, that it had operated for years. And my view is that the workforce had become so sick, and the extent of the knowledge in the workforce and those that were thinking about working there was growing so much that, you know, if you work here, you're not going to smash your thumb, or you could, but I mean, it's not as instant as smashing your thumb, but if you work there long enough, you're going to get very sick and die. That's the reason they moved the plant to Bloomington. I grew up on a farm. I mean, there's a certain pride in working in a dusty area. I mean, you don't stop baling hay because it's dusty, or if you're in the field when the ground is dry, it's dusty. And I think the people like Willard Tipsord and Larry and others in this area had that kind of pride. They were the ideal workforce, because some of these fellows that I represented, you know, they worked there 15, 20, 25 years in this state of ignorance. So Union Asbestos moved their plant down here. A lot of the same machines they used in Bloomington, they brought here from Cicero for no other reason than to get a fresh, ignorant, healthy workforce. And you just can't say enough bad things about an entity that would do that to other people. And it continued even when Owens Corning bought it in 1970. They worked up those people that I mentioned. They didn't tell them that they had asbestos disease, or they were concerned about them having asbestos disease. And the whole, you know, socially and politically and economically, we didn't have as many safeguards in place then as we do now, and somehow they were able to pull off this horrible trickery that allowed people to continue to work there.
Cheryl mentioned the company doctors. Upstairs in the Museum of History, in the asbestos exhibit, there is a long yardstick, essentially, showing the feet of x-rays that were discovered in one of the doctor's offices that were taken of workers at the asbestos plant. That is a lot of health monitoring for workers. How did those happen to be uncovered?
Well, when Union Asbestos sold the Bloomington plant to Owens Corning, Union Asbestos started a plant down at, the name escaped me, I believe it was Robinson, Illinois, anyhow, a town in southeastern Illinois. And when I started taking depositions to try to find, I knew this x-ray program had gone on, but I started to try to find the x-rays. It was just almost humorous when I look back on it, how Frank would say, well, I believe Herman kept those, and then Herman would blame Joe, and on and on and on. And finally, I did find them in this guy's room down in Robinson, and he said, oh yeah, I've had them all this time. Every time you filed a new suit, they would call me from Chicago and ask me to reach into the pile and pull out the x-rays related to the guy for whom you just filed the lawsuit. But unfortunately for the legal repercussions that would have come from that, UNARCO filed for bankruptcy about 10 days after that, and that put an end to the civil litigation. But it would have been great fodder for the litigation to demonstrate how UNARCO had openly and clearly lied about where those x-rays were when all that time they knew and would call this guy for the x-rays. And I'm sorry to push this, but in the x-rays were the written reports about what each x-ray showed, and you could just watch the progression of the disease as the man was x-rayed every year, every 2 years, whatever it turned out to be.
Even with evidence that damning, Bloomington Normal in the 1970s through the 90s was a pretty conservative area. Uniformly Republican judges, conservative jurors. How did you deal with those tendencies that might suggest that they would favor the company?
I agree. I used to try my non-asbestos cases at times of the year when what I thought the most conservative element of the community wouldn't be available, which was primarily farmers, and maybe the liberalist mix, maybe school teachers, so I'd have a shot of avoiding farmers and getting some school teachers and other people that wouldn't have this conservative bent. But oddly enough, as we tried asbestos cases, I found that both our Republican judges and these Republican conservative jurors did not like lying. They were decent people, honest people, and they just didn't expect people to lie. And so I tried to start my case with the biggest, meanest, most dislikable son of a gun that I could put on the stand, get him to tell what I thought would be the most offensive set of lies about not knowing it was hazardous or this or that, whatever the particular thing might be. And with that and other things, we had good luck in front of McLean County judges and jurors. And I think people just said, you know, that ain't right. And particularly, I think somebody mentioned, where did the dust go from the exhaust system at the plant into the western Bloomington air? And there's no known safe distance how long asbestos fibers can travel in the air. So it didn't just increase the west side, it increased everybody. Of course, the farther from the point of discharge, the lower the risk of disease. But still, all those things added up to really kind of an unusual situation in this community, which in the 70s and 80s was still pretty conservative.
So the answer may not be known to this panel, but it begs the question, is that stuff still on the west side?
Union Asbestos had a plant in Paterson, New Jersey. It was highly studied by a man by the name of Selikoff from Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. He did air sampling, he and his crew. He did air sampling in the homes where union asbestos workers used to live, but didn't anymore, and found significant airborne levels of asbestos in those homes 10 and 15 years afterwards. Now, that was the outer limit at the time because, you know, there hadn't enough time passed. He was doing this in the 60s and the 70s. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if you go in those homes today and you've still found some measurable levels of asbestos, but there's no place to put it. Once you dig it out of the ground, where do you put it? If you haul it to the landfill, you've got to make sure you bury it deep enough. If you put it in the insulation of the floor tile or something, every time it gets repaired or removed or changed. I used to say, you know, the only sure place is you put it in the lungs of a worker and you put the worker worker's body in a cast, and then you put the cast in the ground, those fibers won't hurt anybody else. But all the rest of it, once you dig it out of the ground, it has the potential for harm, and in a number of different ways.
George, what does happen to asbestos removed from buildings?
They actually bag it up and bury it in a landfill that is lined.
Lined with what, clay or rubberized material? Or?
Yeah, it's a 12-mil poly that they have down at the bottom, whatever the EPA regulates for them.
Is that good enough?
I guess if they follow the regulation, yes.
Right. Let's spend just a touch more time with Jim. The late McLean County Circuit Court Judge Charles Whitty once told me that some of the best lawyering he ever saw was in asbestos cases. They are fantastically complex. The faces of potential jurors tend to fall when they know they've been picked for that jury because they know they're potentially in for a 3-month haul in service on the trial. Would you talk about how the practice in this area of the law evolved and give an inkling of how complex it is?
Some of the trials were 3 and 4 weeks. I don't think any of them lasted 3 months, but it still was a long time to ask a citizen to stop doing what they had chosen to do and do something else. I filed my first suits in the 1970s. At that time, there was a national group of fellows, practically all my age, within 5 years of my age. I'm now 80. And at first, we were just a bunch of guys, trying to kick shins, but not having much luck. We didn't know that much about the medicine. We didn't know that much about occupational disease. And we were all doing this on a contingency fee basis, and we didn't have much money. So at the start, it was a pretty uphill chug. But as we found more and more documents, the documents tell the same story. Every time you look at a document, it reads the same. It never changes. Witnesses' testimony kind of vary over time and over years and so forth. We shared these documents. We started having our own seminars. The defense lawyers were having seminars all throughout this time. And we gained in our knowledge of medicine and disease and so forth, and the tide just slowly turned in our favor. And then about that time, the biggest companies like Johns Manville and Union Asbestos started going bankrupt. So we had to turn our attention to other companies that weren't quite as black-hearted and weren't quite as evil in their role in this whole tragedy. But it was a gradual progression from a situation where we had a tough road to where things got easier for us, and the system started to work in favor of the worker.
Open question for everyone. Why would business executives who are humans with families, with friends, why would they continue with behavior they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt would kill someone? Thoughts? Cheryl?
Money, greed.
How is this history alive in its implications for today? And let's start with George. How is this history alive in the implications for today?
Can you come back?
Sure. Larry?
Look at global warming. I mean, it's alive right there. I mean, everybody wants to deny global warming. I mean, anybody that's in the financial end of it wants to deny global warming. That may take a long time to kill us, but it's going to kill everything at some point. That's just a small one. but we still have Roundup, we still have fentanyl was supposed to be a wonder thing, you know, and people got addicted and died. Opioids, it's still there. You know, you almost have to say money and greed. Well, what else would it be?
Cheryl?
Ask me the question again.
So how is this history alive, and how can it be made operative as an example for today?
This is still going on today. Workers are working in unsafe environments. It may not be asbestos today, but it is something else. And bottom line, it probably all just comes down to corporate greed. But workers, we try to stay healthy. We walk 10,000 steps and we try to have a healthy diet, and we do all the things we're supposed to do, go for our checkups and try to stay healthy. And yet every day workers go to work and spend their day in an environment that can have safety hazards, health risk. There are still, worker safety is still an issue in many, many respects. It may just not be focused on asbestos now. It may be equipment, it may be other toxins, new toxins now. And I think that exactly the type of thing that happened with the asbestos in UNARCO, starting back in the 50s, I believe that's when Dad was there, it's transitioned into other forms now. And corporate greed is at the root of it. It's really important, I think, that workers understand that they have the right to go to work in a safe and healthy environment. And they need to be educated, and we need to have laws and legislation and just more awareness of that in general.
Jim?
Asbestos was unique in the sense that there was such a long time period between inhalation and pain. The pain didn't burn your throat when you inhaled it. It didn't do anything to you. And the pain only came when, like Cheryl said, her father realized he's sick. He can't breathe as well, or walk as well, or work as well. So this long time period, which could be 20, 30, 40 years with mesothelioma, asbestosis, the non-cancerous disease, it tended to be a little shorter, but still it wasn't immediate. And so in those situations, unless we have warnings, unless we have educational programs, workers just don't learn. And the need for regulation and education for all of the insults to health. Larry mentioned Roundup. I mean, if you're a farm kid, you used to get so sick of walking beans when Roundup came out. All the weeds are gone. My gosh, it looked like a wonderful thing. Now we're learning Roundup is toxic to human health. But so to get back to where I started, those insults to health, which are long between human contact, whether it's inhalation or ingestion or touching or whatever it is, and the manifestation of disease, the only way we know how to protect ourselves from that is if there's laws requiring it or beneficial educational programs to give it to us. And we're seeing now at the national front, the Trump administration is having quite a bit of luck with the old business. So we're going to roll back this red tape. We're going to clear the runway of all these regulations and so forth. Well, most of the regulations involving health were hard fought to be put in place in the first place. So there's no need to consider them a burden on anything. They're a benefit to the worker. But yet, we're currently moving into a political climate where those benefits are being eroded. So I think it speaks to today that there's always a struggle between those in power, whether it's in government or corporate power, and those that are actually doing the work and coming into contact with these substances. There's a struggle to get the information from those that know to those that are at risk.
George?
Okay, I agree with everyone that keep doing, is educate not only the workforce out there, but people in general.
Is there not only a duty to regulate, but a duty to do research so we don't suffer, 1,500 years of ignorance before the dangers of lead are known, or, nearly a century, or nearly 60 or so years before the dangers to the heart of phthalates and other plastics are known? Anybody, any thoughts there? Who is to do that research? Who is to seek that knowledge before the profit motive to externalize costs takes over?
Well, don't we currently, as a society, do a little of that in foodstuffs through the FDA and so forth, where you have to have permission to release, not foodstuffs, but medications. You have to have permission to release your product. In order to get that permission, you're supposed to show that you studied the health effects. But I think for a lot of our products, we don't really regulate permission to sell. You don't have to have permission to sell a bottle of water or this or that, it's helpful to somebody who chooses to defend these cases to be able to show that the company did do some research before it launched the product, but that's not always done. And
again,
we're currently in an environment that doesn't seem to support the implication of that duty.
right now, we're seeing, just pick up any newspaper, listen to the news, and we're seeing how much funding is being pulled for different forms of research that are related to health issues. And some of those are going to relate to safety, things that we're exposed to, that we consume, whatever, affecting our health. And that funding's being pulled back right now. And seriously, that is a step backwards for us, that I'm not sure where that's headed or how we offset that, but it's happening.
Thank you all. Let's bring the audience into it and take some audience questions. So if you have a question, I'll come to you and let you use the microphone for just a few minutes. Anybody with questions out here? Yeah.
Yeah, Jim, I assume that there was never any criminal prosecution, even though they knew what was happening.
I am not aware of anyone that's been criminally prosecuted for selling asbestos or, providing a workplace that was unsafe.
Kind of like the sacklers and the opioids.
I'm sorry?
Sort of like the sacklers and the opioids.
That's right. That's right.
Not so much a question. What I find offensive is when a corporation does a calculation as to whether it's more cost-effective to continue as is or do the right thing. When there's a problem with a vehicle, they calculate how many deaths this will cause and the cost of that versus the recall. Well, we'll only spend half as much if we let these people die. And to me, that's just so offensive that it's almost untenable.
Thoughts from the panel on that? Okay, next question.
Well, one thing, we do have punitive damages, and that's one place where jurors do express themselves similar in a manner to you, that, well, you'd have been better if you had have spent this money and fixed this fault, but now that you didn't and you chose to go ahead and put it out there, it hurt this family, so we're going to transfer a little bit of what you've got over to the family to compensate them and also to punish you.
You had a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if anybody knows. Most of the developed countries in the world, I'm sure, have awareness of and things to pretty much ban asbestos. But we have billions of people living in China, living in other underdeveloped areas. Is asbestos still being used in some areas of the world in total disregard for what is known?
I would imagine yes on that. And
3 questions or comments. Sorry to scaffold them like that, but first I just wanted to express my appreciation for coming out into the community and still sharing this. I'm an Iowan, but I worked at the Ames Lab site of the Manhattan Project some time ago, and I researched the closure of the former nuclear plutonium plant, Rocky Flats, as it went to closure in 2005. So I've lived this as a worker, as a researcher, and every couple of years I get tested by the Ames Lab Former Worker Program in Iowa City for potential exposure to borreliosis. Because of COVID, I haven't been up there. I'm late. I've delayed my testing. So one of my questions is, how much faith do you think I could have that I'm getting accurate information in terms of medical diagnosis and so forth? A next question is, because I'm a researcher, and at this point it's historical, the interviews that I did is archival. I'm very impressed by the exhibit here, and I was able to listen to Ericka Wills recently, because I'm in the English department at ISU. What is the interest in terms of the public, in terms of dissemination of information? What are people even interested really in reading about these issues and so forth? And the third question is, I live 10 minutes from the UNARCO plant. I'm in the Lash Acres division of South Bloomington, which is, as I said, it's 10 minutes away. How safe do you think I am?
Thoughts there?
Those are good questions.
Well,
Tough ones.
my knowledge of the use of beryllium has been more by the government, and to some extent, if we want to line up evildoers, I think the federal government is a little less evil than some of the leading corporate evildoers. And so they might be doing closer to right by you in beryllium. The last thing you said I wanted to comment on too, what was that?
Lash Acres on the west side.
Oh, okay. I don't think anybody has done any airborne testing in Bloomington for quite some time, and but we do know that, as common sense would tell you, that wherever you start at the point of dispersion into the air, whether it's coming out of a smokestack or a dust collection system or whatever, it's going to dissipate, sort of like gas or anything, airborne gas, and the concentration will be greater here than it is here than it is there. That was certainly true when they measured asbestos from plant discharge points back in the 60s and 70s and 80s when the plants were operating. So all I can say is I don't know of any air sampling this long after a plant. I suspect that it is not much of a risk, and I've not heard of anybody having a neighborhood disease case in Bloomington, for decades. There were some back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Well, if not airborne, how about in the soil? George, how persistent is it in the soil, and how can it become airborne again? And should we worry about ever, not that there's that much demand right now, but ever redeveloping that west side site?
Well, the only way that it can be airborne, especially if it's in the soil, if it's like cultivated or
redeveloped.
And I would imagine that, knowing the history of that site, there would be some form of air testing as it's going on, just to make sure, or core sampling even beforehand.
Jim, does the EPA require such testing on old industrial sites that have used asbestos? Do you happen to know?
Well, if there's reason to believe that asbestos had been used there, I think there is, but I don't know if it's one of those things that has to be done, without such knowledge.
Okay. Other questions still to come? Anybody?
You want to share what you found working the site?
Yeah, let's go back here.
Mike asked me to share a little tidbit. Before we opened the exhibit, I went out to the site of where the UNARCO plant was. The building itself burnt down in the 90s, and while we were out there in the very undeveloped site, there were little black chunks with white fibers sticking out. I'm not a scientist. I cannot verify that it is asbestos, but it's what I think are little spurts of asbestos. That site is, there are a few unhoused individuals living out there right now, and it is a big opportunity for growth in the city to see that redeveloped, hopefully sometime.
All right, are there any other questions or comments from the audience here before we go to our closing act? Anybody else at all? Well, let me invite Ericka up here to do our closing. Ericka Wills is a labor educator and activist who just received the Spotlight Award from Illinois State University, raising up her achievements in her chosen field. And apart from the self-confessed flaw of not being able to parallel park, she is perfect.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I think that's one answer to the question that you ask of, do people care? Is the people who showed up today, the people who are watching this now, answers that question. My name's Ericka Wills. Cheryl Wills here is my mother. Willard Tipsword was my grandfather. He died when I was 6 years old. My earliest memories are of a strong man I loved and I trusted and I looked up to both figuratively and literally as he towered 6'6", becoming more frail, more weak, more sick, unable for me to even crawl up on his lap, and him dying. And me only knowing it was because a company had done something bad that made him sick. And it was something for a long time my family didn't talk about. It is extremely difficult for my mother to be up here talking about not only the death of her father, but the death of her brother recently, who as a child was exposed to this. And another generation is being killed off. So, no, I didn't get to have the relationship with, the mentoring from my grandfather, but his story shaped me. It shaped what I do today. I flew in just a couple hours ago from being with the United Auto Workers at their education center at Black Lake in Michigan for their worker health and safety conference. I'm wearing the t-shirt here. Has the name on the back of those who have died on the job since the 1970s. Just last week, I got a call at 6 a.m. from the president of the United Auto Workers saying they'd had a fatality in one of their plants. He was on his way to do a safety inspection, and he'd have to be with the family at the funeral. Just last week. We ask if this still happens. This happens in a million ways. Every time a worker goes to work, they should have faith that they will be coming home safe, that they're not being exposed to something that down the road, we'll find out, kills them through occupational diseases. So I want to talk about some facts here. I'm going to talk about some facts, and then I'm going to talk about some feelings, because I think at this point in time, it's really important for us to divide out those two and talk about what are facts and what are feelings. So here's some facts. How many people have been to the exhibit, first of all? Good. Do you remember there's a panel that talks about how the Department of Labor at the time could issue citations but couldn't give fines or penalties that would actually create change back in the 1950s when my grandpa was working there. That doesn't really change until the 1970s with the establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Act. This creates two things. It creates, number one, NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, which does research and training related to safety and health issues, and also OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that develops and enforces safety standards. In 1977, we get the MSHA, the Mining Safety and Health Administration, which works specifically in mines. And I want to talk about those agencies because here's a fact, NIOSH. We talk about, well, who does this research? Why is this research important? You know who does this research? Research universities, who increasingly are getting defunded, their grants taken away, and NIOSH. Just this month, 90% of NIOSH's employees got axed. That means for every 1,000 down to 100. That is a fact that is a direct attack on workers' health and safety today. It's a fact that's taking us back in time. We talk about where's this in other places? Where do we see this today? I work often with people who are struggling to breathe because they work in mines. I work with coal miners, open pit and underground, often represented by the United Mine Workers of America. I work with copper miners, gold miners in the US and in Mexico, represented by Los Mineros in Mexico and the United Steelworkers in the US. And these workers are directly under attack when MSHA gets defunded, when 34 MSHA offices are closed down in the last 100 days we've had. When we don't know, when if there's an emergency, there'll be someone to show up. We don't know who's going to do the inspection. We don't know, the people working at those offices don't know what's going to happen right now. That's an attack on them as workers, and it's an attack on everyone that they are there to serve. Some of what NIOSH was doing and developing, if you're in a mine and there's a safety hazard, you're underground, there's a leak of toxic gases, you have a self-contained self-rescuer that has a certain amount of oxygen to help you get out. This covers your mouth, and it becomes very difficult to communicate during that emergency. And NIOSH was in the beta testing phase of developing those respirators where they could communicate back and forth, speaking into them. Who knows how many lives that technology that we're on the cusp of, but we've cut 90% of NIOSH. Also, when we look at MSHA, and I talk about the people who I work with who are struggling to breathe, it's because increasingly in the United States, when we're doing mining, we're mining more rock. If it's coal, it's smaller coal seams. It's producing more rock dust, and that causes silicosis. It causes a different type of black lung than just coal dust does. And MSHA has been developing NIOSH has been developing, and MSHA has been promoting dust devices that can measure dust in real time. So people know, is this over or under the limit? This needs to be implemented. It needs to be enforced. Workers, and increasingly through their unions, the United Steelworkers and the United Mine Workers have worked to lower the amount of silicate dust that can be breathed in mines. Currently, under MSHA, that amount is higher than in an industrial setting that's regulated by OSHA. They got a lower limit passed, and in the last 100 days, the decision has been made to not enforce that regulation. So we talk about passing regulations, we talk about laws, and that's fantastic. But if we don't enforce them, they are not worth the paper they are written on. And we do not enforce those if we're not funding the agencies who do that. And we are not supporting the workers in the way that they can self-advocate as well. So all of this is a direct attack on workers. Through human health and human services, HHS has eliminated any tools for minors to be able to self-advocate when they've taken away the funding for training on how to read the x-rays that are done on minors who try to go and say, do I have black lung? Can I get testing? Is that available? And many times those are in rural areas where they have to travel to be able to do that. So these are all things that I think begin to answer in a different way some of the questions that were asked today. We're using the court systems. The United Steelworkers and the United Mine Workers have filed a federal case to try to keep the dust enforcement, the silicate dust enforcement in place. But we think about courts, and we think about the attack on workers' rights, and there's another element to that I want to talk about in relation to what we see up there. This has to do with I talked about the Department of Labor and the enforcement of actual rights. Another thing is, do we have the ability to go to court and enforce our rights? Because oftentimes at UNARCO, workers were given that Paisley little amount and said, sign this paper and say you won't sue us, and here's something to take if it looked like that they were going to be eased out because they were going to be in bad health. Currently, we have around 60 million workers in the U.S. who are at-will employees and work under mandatory arbitration agreements, which means as a condition of employment, they have signed away their ability to, in some ways, enforce their Sixth Amendment right to go to court and sue their employer, and instead have to arbitrate things like health and safety exposure, one by one by one by one. What does that do? It means that the legal discovery process that allowed for all the documentation to be turned over doesn't occur in the courts. It means all of those things that you see up there on the wall that were produced don't get turned over. There's no court record. It's not public record what happens in those arbitrations. And the case law, there's no case law for that either. It's a way to take away workers' rights to go to court, and I would argue too, under the National Labor Relations Act, that Section 7 protects our collective action. Going to court and suing as a class should be protected action, but as of the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Epic Systems versus Lewis in 2018, filing a class action case is no longer considered covered under Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act as collective action, and instead, the mandatory individual arbitration agreements can be upheld as a condition of employment. So, those are some facts. Those are some facts about what's going on. So I want to talk about how I feel about that to close off. You asked about the costs of this, the costs on families. I feel that safe working conditions is a human right. I deeply believe this. I feel and believe that universal health care, without going bankrupt, without losing generational wealth, is a human right. I believe that we have to ask ourselves, which lives are we considering disposable when we decide to make cuts to NIOSH, to make cuts to the enforcement agencies in the government that takes care of workers? Just like those little paper masks that were given that didn't do any good, that you could just throw away. What lives are we willing to throw away, and why? Who profits from it? Who's making money off of it? Just like we saw, and the question was asked, why would good people do this? Why would someone who has a family do this? I believe the answer is greed. I also believe that the most effective counterbalance to unfettered corporate greed and the concentration of wealth at the top in our society is unions. I believe it's solidarity. I believe it's collective action. I believe it's taking the streets. I believe it's protesting. I believe it's exercising your rights. I believe it's educating workers. I believe it's standing up for what you believe in. I believe it's civil disobedience, and I believe all those things can be done through empowering workers, and all of us in this room are workers. Paid workers, unpaid workers, public workers, private sector workers, we are workers. And it is our right in this country to stand up together as workers. And on behalf of other workers that are losing their lives and getting these rights taken away from them. So this is a speech that I don't like to give. I don't want to give. This hurts me. I lost sleep over this. I cried. I didn't know if I could get up here and talk about this because it's this personal to me. Those memories. It has shaped what I do every day with my life. It has taken time away from my family. My daughter Willow is here. The time that I am on the road as an advocate for workers. But I deeply believe it's important because I still have hope. I still have hope that we can stand up together. We can turn back those losses over the last 100 days. Because we can't go back to what we see upstairs in that exhibit, what we learn about. We can't go back to that. And the only way to go forward is all of us. All of us for each other, and all of us as an advocate for the least of us. Think about that as you go through the exhibit. Think about the way that that exhibit is living history, is now, the direction that we're going, and what each of us individually and more importantly together can do to go in the direction we believe we should be going. So thank you all for taking the time to be here. This in and of itself, I think, is an important collective action in educating yourself. Don't let it stop here. Go to your neighbors, go to your friends, tell them what you've heard, bring them to the exhibit. Knowledge is power. Voting is power. Coming together is power, and now is the time to exercise that. So thank you all, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you, Ericka Wills, and thanks to LaUNA for sponsoring this panel discussion tonight. Thanks to WGLT for sponsoring the online presence as well. Thank you very much, panelists, and thank you, the audience. Good night.